Hello and welcome to another Factorio Megabase tutorial video. I'm Exterminator and thank you for joining me again. Today in this episode we're going to look a lot at rails, rail design, junction placement, and spacing of your builds. Now we looked at this a little bit last episode, but I wanted to dive a bit deeper into it for this episode since I know quite a few people can struggle with this and I get a lot of questions in relation to rails as well for megabases. So I think this is kind of the next progressive step in the process of making a megabase, and there's some few key decisions you're going to need to make about your base and specifically in regards to trains for this step. So I'm on a quick little test map to start with. I'm going to show you a few quick examples and explain some things, and then we're going to hop into two of my other saves, which I have looked at previously in this series, to show you even more like live examples of actual bases running with some pros and cons of doing certain things and some differences. So let's just get started here. When you go to place your builds and decide spacing but between the builds, this is very, very important, as well as how you connect them to the rails. So it depends also on the size of megabase you're building. For our example, I mentioned this in the first episode, we're going to do 1,000 science per minute as our benchmark, our goal for any examples in this series. Now, with 1,000 science per minute, I have my Factorio Lab calculator up in another screen here, and we'll start with some circuits for this example. It says we need 33,000 circuits per minute. Now, depending on the build you design, you may need, let's just say you're doing 1,000 science per minute as well. Depending on the size of the circuit build you make, because, your build may be different than mine, you may need 2 builds, you may need 1 build, you may need 5 builds, depending how big you make them. And this is going to determine how you space things out. For the build I'm using, this is a build I've had for a very long time. This one in particular does about 31,000 green circuits per minute. So I'm actually in a very awkward position where I would end up needing more than one of these, but 2 would be a lot of overkill. So what I may end up doing, hypothetically for something like this, is placing one of these builds and then maybe trimming down a version of it. So maybe chopping off the end rows of it. So the shorter row on the top of the build and the short row on the bottom, to kind of reduce the production a bit of the second one and place a second one. And then, for red circuits, it says we need 7,555. And one of my builds of the red circuits here does 11,000. So I only need one of these. And then blue circuits we should be set on as well. We only need 1,000 a minute. And my blue circuit build does about 3.6K a minute, which is actually quite a lot of overkill. Same with the red circuits for that matter. So I would maybe trim these down as well. No use taking up the extra space and machines and all that stuff just for no reason, really. Definitely you do want to overproduce a bit though. My point in mentioning all this though is with spacing. So in this case, I don't really need that many circuit builds. If you were in a case where you needed a lot more, you would really, really need to consider your spacing on rails and how you connect them. So I have a 2-lane rail here set up as a quick example. And let's just hypothetically say I was going to put one of these builds, we'll just put it, here. Now, obviously you would need room for a full junction and stuff, but the point of me doing this is in terms of spacing between the builds. So if we have this one here and it connects to this rail, based on the setup of this build, we have 2 trains that are absolutely going to need to probably come in from here because, the stations are up here, so they're going to have to enter from this side. Now, this one does enter from the other side. There is a potential I would want to do a pull through, meaning that it pulls through here as if it were a single-headed train and leaves on this rail as well. But what we don't want to do, so when we place one build, regardless of if it's another green circuit build or blue circuit build or red circuit build or even smelters, and smelters may definitely be a case for this because you will very likely need multiple smelters of each type. We do not want to just take our next build and just plop it down like right here. Even though technically in between the builds themselves there's enough space, there's not really an issue here. When it goes to connect to the rail, this is significantly too close to each other for multiple reasons. Now, your train size, this is where your train size really comes into play. And this is when you need to decide, when you build your builds, you obviously need to decide on train size if you're having your trains come into the build. If you're just doing like a belt base or even with bots and you have just general train drop-offs that are then like botted or belted to the other builds, then this may not be as big of a concern, but you still do need to decide your train size before you build your rail system. And the reason for this is because your junction spacing is going to depend quite a lot on your train size. There are other factors that come into play here, which I will explain, but your train size is going to be important for this because the minimum space between two junctions, the absolute like bare minimum, should be the size of your longest train, meaning that your longest train can park between two junctions. Like if it's stopped on the track waiting in a traffic jam or whatever, it can be in between two junctions and not have its front or its end sticking out into the junction in front of it or behind it, because then that creates blocks of things entering or exiting those junctions, and then one train is just stopping the entire rail system. And that's the absolute minimum. I would say you need a lot more than that. Like that's just, if you just want to go bare minimum, that is the bare minimum. So for this case, if I were to put this here, my trains in this, I believe, are 363s. And a 363 is, eyeballing it, not going to fit here. It may very barely fit here, depending on if I bring the rails down from the closest rails to these builds on this red circuit build. But this would be just significantly too close. I would personally leave probably 2, maybe even 3 train links between your junctions. And this does also depend on the actual volume of trains you're going to be having on here. If you only have maybe 2 trains in a build that only go in every 5 minutes, and you only have like a few of those builds, so maybe you only have like 10 trains connected, that are going to be using this rail, and they're spread out several minutes apart, you could probably definitely get away with having the minimum of a train link space between your junctions. But in an example we're going to show here shortly in one of my saves, if you have more of a higher throughput and volume amount of trains, you absolutely want to be spacing your builds significantly farther apart. And the other key thing, not necessarily connecting them all to the same main line. So it can be instinctive to just connect everything to this main line. However, you may want to set up your builds in such a way where you have multiple main lines. Maybe there's another one above it. Not this for another example I'm going to show you. Maybe we have another main line above this, where some of these trains come in from that, and it connects somewhere far away, or maybe even it's a completely separate main line. So like if this were a smelter, would be a perfect example of this. Maybe you have your ore trains on an entirely separate rail line that has no connections whatsoever to your other rail line where all your intermediate and end products are. And then in yet another example I'm going to show you here, that is the case, and it helps a lot. So these are just things to consider, when you go to do your spacing, and this is really only viable for using builds where the builds are separated. If you do something like I did in my tightening the belt base that I showed in a couple episodes in this series, where I did a Megabase belt base, but it was basically just a huge bus. Like I didn't have separate builds throughout the map. It was just a massive main bus, like all local production thing. Obviously, I'm not having builds all spaced out throughout the map, all connecting to the main line. I just had basically ore trains and oil trains and stone trains and all that come in to the main base, and everything was just made there, and like there were no other trains. In which case, the only rule that if you're doing something like that, the only rule you really need to then consider is just your junction spacing in general. You still want to follow the bare minimum of your longest train fitting between two junctions, even if you don't have builds like throughout your map connecting to the main line like this. You just never should really put junctions closer together than a train can fit in, ever. There's not really ever a reason, unless it's like super temporary, or there's some like emergency situation or something. I mean, honestly, I was gonna say maybe for like a little fuel train that's gonna go somewhere like every 10 minutes, or something, it would maybe be okay. But just generally, I would say just never ever put your junctions closer than what I've said here, because it's just going to cause you problems. And truly, space is nearly infinite in Factorio. You know, you can blow up cliffs, you can clear trees, you can landfill over water. There really are no obstacles. Biters would honestly probably be the biggest obstacle you're going to run into. And, you know, those can certainly be dealt with in multiple ways. So there's really no disadvantage to spacing the builds out aside from having to just move a little extra distance and like build a little extra rails, which in the grand scheme of things and having a working base is a very, very small sacrifice. I wouldn't really even consider it a sacrifice. So these are things to consider. Now, a question I actually probably get the most in regards to Rails when it comes to Megabase is people will ask, how many lanes should I use? Like, how big of a rail system should I use? Should I use a 2-lane? Should I use a 4-lane? Should I use a 10-lane? And this can be a hard question to answer, and I don't think there's necessarily a like specific threshold at which you need to be using a 4-lane over a 2-lane, or like, you know, anything like that. However, I would say in general, if you just have a very large amount of trains on your map, very large meaning probably like 200, 300 plus, you would probably want to be using more than just a 2-lane rail system, at least in my opinion. There are certainly cases where people have 400 trains and are running a 2-lane rail system, and they made it work. So it's not impossible. And the other thing, though, the flip side of that is once you get to a certain point, adding lanes doesn't really do very much. You know, like if you have a 16-lane rail system, you know, 8 lanes in each direction, you're not really gaining that much over just using like a 4-lane. You know, if you ask almost any Megabaser, if you ask like Mojo or you know, Colonel Will even probably, and some of the other Megabasers out there, they said this before. At least several of the people I've talked to and played with, you know, we would agree, and they would agree that, you know, once you hit a certain point, like just adding more rails doesn't really do very much. You know, you should be able to get away with like a 4-lane rail system up to a absolutely gigantic base. This should work for. I mean, honestly, this should work for basically any base size. I would say you can maybe go to like a 6-lane rail system if you really want to, because the thing is, the devs have made Factorio, have made the train pathing of Factorio better, and like made the trains a bit quote unquote smarter, but they're still not. It's not a real person driving these things, right? So unless now, if you twick and fiddle and tweak with your junctions and how things turn off in your lanes, you can really take advantage of this. But if you just place down a rail system with a ton of lanes in it and stuff and try to depend on the trains doing the right thing, you're not gaining anything. Trust me, I've done this before, and it does not help. And here's the reason for that. As this rail system stands, it does have some advantage over a 2-lane system, just purely by the fact that, you know, you can have 2 trains moving here from left to right at the same time, because you have 2 rails, and the same with right to left is you know, compared to just 1 on the 2-lane system, because you only have 1 lane. So it does have that advantage, but when it comes to actually like turning into builds using junctions and not creating backups, unless you do tweaking to kind of isolate your rail connections, the trains are very likely not going to be smart enough to do what you would hope they would do. You know, like if you have, say, 2 trains that need to go to a build that's up here, okay, and they're coming from somewhere, and you leave this junction as is, ideally, what we would like, as you might imagine, is 1 train to be on this line and use this lane to turn in, and then the other one on this line, so that they're not backed up behind each other, and then there's nothing happening here. However, that is very likely probably not going to be the case. It may happen just by, you know, chance, but the trains are not that smart, okay? So to really take advantage of these larger amount of lanes, you need to do some tweaking. And it's not that difficult. It's just a little bit tedious, and you know, unless you actually take the time and thought to do it, you're not really gaining much from doing something like this. Now, what we could do is you could force the trains to do this. So let's say, for example, we have a build here, and we want the trains to this build to only use this inside lane here. We can just simply disconnect this entire thing. Like, we can just redo this entire junction and get rid of this connection entirely here. And then, the trains for this build can only use this. There's no way to enter through this lane. And then if we want, depending, the pattern in which you do this is kind of up to you and such, but you could do every other, so you could then have the next build only be connectable from this line. Or you could do it in sets of however many, so you could have like this build and your next build only connectable from this inside line, and then the next two builds after that only connectable to the outside line, and so on and so forth, to force your trains to spread out. Because what this is doing is spreading them out, instead of, and this is where you gain the advantage of more lanes, because on this, you are forced to one lane. That's all there is. So all your trains for every single thing on a main line here is all going to be in one lane. So if one thing backs up, it backs up everything behind it. Whereas with this, if you force your trains to do, to only go in from one lane every few builds or however you want to do it, then you are forcing them to space out. So let's say this stops here for whatever reason it can't enter. It may stop the trains for this build and maybe any other builds that use this line, but all the other builds that use this line, they're free to go. They can just keep cruising along. And this is where you do gain the advantage of having multiple lanes in your rail system. You just have to actually take advantage of it and do some things yourself, because it's very unlikely the trains are actually going to figure out to do this on their own, because I've tried this. Now, maybe the devs have done something that I'm unaware of. They have made trains much more likely to do this, but when I did this quite a while ago on my bases, the trains were not smart enough to do this, and I had to force them. But it did pay off. So that's just something to mention here, and I am going to show you some examples of this. So I think it's about time we hop into these saves and I show you some actual live examples. So hopefully this did make sense in regards to the size of your rail systems. Like I said, 4 lanes should suit you all. Like, honestly, if you do it right, this should be fine for like 10k signs a minute, 15k signs. I mean, this should be good for basically anything if you use it correctly. You could go up to 6 or 8. You just, unless you're really, really tweaking it and such, it's kind of a waste at that point. Unless you were just really, really messing with it to make it do what you want. So I hope that helped. Now, to actually show you examples of this spacing and such, let's go ahead and hop into a couple saves here. So if we go to my Supplying Atlantis, which we have looked at multiple times before. It will take a minute to load because it's switching out the mods here. So if we do this, go in here, and I've looked at this before, but we're gonna look at it a bit closer here in potentially a little bit of a different way as the map loads here. We will notice that we have all these builds in a line on this mainline section here. And the first thing you may notice is there's a lot of junctions, and a lot of them are very close together. And this is a mistake. I will be the first to admit this was very poor building on my part. And now, I do want to mention, you may not notice, at first glance, you may not notice much of a difference between this and what I'm going to show you in my next base that I load up. Because they do use very similar concepts. They actually both just connect to like one main line. But there are some very key differences. And I'll be interested if you guys notice them before I mention them or not. So, in this one, a lot of these junctions are not spaced correctly. I believe this one, well, this one I don't think is. There's no way this train can fit in there. So, this one's too close, this one's too close. Obviously, this one just shouldn't even be here. This one I think is okay, barely. I modified a few of these. This one's okay, like barely, bare minimum. Again, definitely want to go farther than that. So, first issue we notice here, these are spaced too close together. I put these builds way too close together, and this is an example of what you do not want to do. Okay, I have 2 red circuit builds. Now, granted, this one I added later. This one was not here. When I first built this, it was just this, and then like this, and this, and all that. However, even then, it was too close because there's a lot of traffic here, and as you can see, we're having some stop and go here just because, I have to have signals on here so we don't have crashes. So every time a train slows down, it's slowing down the ones behind it because there's just really no room to breathe on this rail system here. I put my red circuit build, I put another red circuit build, a module build, a massive green circuit build here, which is actually not too bad the way I've designed it, but it certainly has room for improvement, and we can see how this could be improved in the next map we're going to look at. And then, in addition to that, we have not all, but a decent amount of our mining and smelting because we're doing on-site smelting. So a decent amount of our plate trains are on this line as well, and they all have to go to the left. There's nowhere for them to go this way. So they're all going this way. So the vital mistake I've made a few here, is putting builds too close. That's the first lesson. Also, connecting too many builds to the same main line. You will see a few other connections, like over here, and this was added pretty recently. Even this isn't great. It's on like another section, but it's still pretty close to here, and it all feeds into the same junction, which is, that's fairly close together in the grand scheme of things. So that still isn't great. And then also putting, the other mistake is putting all of these, plate train and ore or smelting, all on here and all having to go the same direction. That's the other issue, is that they all have to go the same direction. This is sending uranium trains. This is sending like 4 outposts worth of iron trains and a coal train and a coal outpost worth of trains all in the same direction. And a lot of them are going right here, so then there's even more traffic you're just shoving in here. And you can see this, guys. Like, you can see this in real life, and obviously it's nowhere near as fixable in real life as in Factorio. But if you place all of your, or not all, but in cities and such where a large amount of people all work in one section of the city, that's what rush hour is, right? Everybody goes to work and then everyone leaves work, and a large amount of people are all going in the same direction to the same general destination at the same time. And while it's more predictable because you have times that people start and end work, the same thing applies here. It may not be as predictable because we're not on like set schedules for these. There are kind of production cycles and such, but the same principle applies. This is in a sense, this could be considered like the downtown, and then like everything out here is like that the living neighborhood suburb and stuff, and everything's just all going here, all leaving from here, and this is just, this is a disaster. This is actually working really well right now. There was a large period of time where this was just a traffic jam throughout this entire thing, and we were having major issues elsewhere on our map because none of the trains could get where they needed to go. So they were running late for work, if you will. But yeah, this is an example of just something you do not want to do. Now, how can we fix this? What is a counterexample of this? You may be looking at this, okay, well, that's great extern, but how can I not do this? Okay, well, here's an example. We're going to load into another map, and I use this map a lot because well, a lot of the principles in here, at least in the builds, are somewhat outdated. I still very much stand by a lot of the stuff on this map that I'm going to show you, and it's still like probably one of my all-time favorite maps that I've ever built here. Sending the supporters to space. This is the biggest base I've ever built, and this is an example, I would say. Now, there is some train stuff in here that is questionable. At the time, it seemed like an ingenious idea, and it works. However, with the train abilities and technologies we have now, some of this is quite questionable. However, what I'm going to show you is kind of unrelated to that, so it should be okay. This will load up here shortly as it figures out the mod situation. But this takes advantage of several things that are different but kind of the same as the map we just looked at. The first one being, and if this doesn't load, I may just do a quick cut here and come back once it decides to load up. I'm not entirely sure what the hangup is. I think we will be right back, guys. I'm going to do a quick cut so we don't continue waiting, and I will see you here in a quick second. Alrighty, we're back. I just had to disable my creative mod, and I think that was causing the issue. So back to the topic at hand. The things that this utilizes that make this different, so at first glance, and this is actually using a 4-lane rail system. At first glance, you may think, well, I don't really see much difference because you have all these junctions kind of close together, all connecting to each other on this one rail line here. And that is very true. You would be correct. However, and I mean, there are still some issues, I suppose. However, a few things are very different here. The first one being that our ore trains are completely separate from everything else. All of the ore trains funnel in to these massive things, which I'm not really going to go into. However, all the ore trains all come in through these main lines, and they only come from from here and down. You can see they spread out very far, all the way down to here. They have absolutely no connection and interaction whatsoever with anything up here that are intermediate and finished products, because what they do is they go in here and they transfer. We were using modded entities for this, but if the entities were here, they would transfer the ore from one train to another, and these ore trains within, you can see these are separate rail systems here, would come in and then go to their respective smelters, and then the plate trains are on yet another rail system, so the ore trains just absolutely have no interaction whatsoever with any of the other trains, and they go to where they need to. So that's the first thing, right? Because if you recall, in Supplying Atlantis, all the ore plate trains were like on the same line, all going the same direction, the same place. The other major thing, and you may have spotted this, is we have some pretty ridiculous point-to-point systems in here. I would say these are almost like little like point-to-point highways, because and this eliminates a ton of trains, guys. This eliminates a massive amount of trains. We have a huge system here of point-to-point lanes, and you can just see, if we just watch this for a second, there's a fair bit of train activity going on here. And some of this is not working because the recipes have changed and stuff. But what this is doing is nearly all, except it looks like one gear build and one iron build, it looks like, are the only things that actually go up out of here into the main line. Everything else here, and the large majority of things here, except for I think 3 or 4 of these builds, all stay within this little kind of segregated section here, because we have point-to-point systems that are bringing iron and copper over to each circuit build, all the way up to all these. I believe there's 7 circuit builds, and they all have direct connections here from both copper and iron. And then within that, the majority of these have direct connections to the things they go to without ever hitting the main line. So again, this is a point-to-point going to red circuits and blue circuits and modules, and only one of these builds actually, I think, proceeds somewhere onto the main line. In fact, I'm not even sure. Maybe none of them do. I don't remember exactly on this map. I know at least one has to somewhere. But this is going all direct within here. So that's just eliminating probably 70-80% of the plate trains, almost all of the circuit trains, because the larger majority of circuits are used for higher level circuits and modules. It's eliminating all those trains from the main line. So yes, there's a lot of junctions here because there are a lot of things that still need trains to go to them, but there's not that many trains actually going to these places. And you will see that I did really kind of just do the bare minimum here of junction spacing. I should have spaced farther. However, we did get away with it in this instance, because really the only things coming into here are things like coal and looks like in some barrels we were doing oil with barrels. So some coal, some barrels, some sulfuric acid is coming in here, and that's just about it. Now we do have our science builds all up here. They are spread out a bit. This is certainly more room between junctions than this. And then, so this is half the science builds. And then the other half I decided to put over here, which also helped because what this is doing is it's kind of dividing our trains, right? So some of the trains go left, some of the trains go right. And it's not like all the trains are all going left or they're all going right. And I'm also spacing them out quite a lot. This is a decent amount of space here. And then we are using a 4-lane rail system. Now you will notice I haven't really tweaked these much to take a lot of advantage because my main reason for using this was just to allow multiple trains to travel on the main line simultaneously in the same direction, like right here, for example. So that is very helpful. And sometimes the train is smart enough to utilize both lanes to exit. So that is the key differences here. And what to take away from this is I showed you an example of what not to do. And I'm not saying that you have to build something like this, but do consider taking advantage of point-to-point systems. Maybe not, I mean, if you're building to this scale, then potentially like this, but just in general, like if you can send plate trains directly to circuit builds without putting them on the main line, definitely I would consider doing that. Or if you can send circuits to circuit builds. I did do that a little bit in supplying Atlantis. I had a lot of my green circuit trains going to red and blue circuits without going on the main line. However, there were still quite a few going elsewhere. So that's just something to consider is point-to-point rail systems, and again, spreading out your junctions, separating builds so you can be sending trains multiple directions rather than sending all of your traffic in one direction to like one general destination. It is very much split up in this case. Now you will notice a pretty severe backup here. Now, part of this is just due to this something being broken here and that's just not working. It looks like there's no copper ore for because we're not transferring, etc. But the other thing here to note is that this is backed up, but again, it's so far spaced away that even though there's like 15 trains backed up behind each other here, it's actually not affecting the main line. And I think I by accident or on purpose may have built this in such a way to where it can fit basically all of our plate trains without them backing into the main line. Whereas if I had not put it this far away and given myself this much space, this would be backing up the main line, all the way like up to here or something, and then we'd be having some problems. But obviously resources are not where they are needing to go because of production issues and backups, but it's not actually affecting the rest of the traffic in my base. So this is, I think, a prime example of just leaving yourself enough space, building a rails long enough in far away from the main line or far away enough from other builds to where if there is a little bit of a backup, it doesn't necessarily affect your entire rail system. And if we watch this, there's not that much traffic. Now a lot of the base isn't running, but even when it was, we got this to a point where there was like almost no backups. It was just, there were quite a few trains, but it was smooth sailing. And this took a lot of planning and a lot of, messing around and moving stuff, rebuilding things. But sometimes that's what it takes, guys. And I hope this has been helpful to you with your rail systems and maybe what size rail to build and how far to space them and, where to place your junctions and builds. And if you do have further questions, please leave them below and let me know what you'd like to see in next episode or future episodes in general. As a last thing to touch on, I did have some people ask why I am not just building a brand, like building a Megabase from start to finish for the series. And the reason is that is a massive amount of work. It's a huge endeavor to build a Megabase, and I simply do not have the time right now. Unfortunately, I have so many things. I'm stretched in so many different directions right now. I just simply do not have the time to put in to build a whole Megabase just for the series. And I think that we have enough examples to where I can pretty much get the point across of what I need to without actually building a Megabase. Please let me know if you think that if there's something that's super glaring that I'm missing that, that could only be achieved with building a Megabase, from start to finish. And I will try my best to, present that the best way I can here. But I did want to just, let you know, anyone who is wondering that, those are the reasons I decided not to just build a Megabase start to finish here for this series. Anyway, that's going to do it. Thank you so much for watching. I do hope this was helpful. And if you have any questions and thoughts, please leave them below. If you did find it helpful and enjoyed, a like is much appreciated so others can find it as well. If you're new to the channel and not subscribed, feel free to subscribe, turn on notifications to keep up with all future content. And until next time, I look forward to seeing you all, and do take care.